clever combination, but it's partly moving the packages, but as Margie says, it's also partly changing what is inside of each package, right? So it's changing the productivity in the process within a structure and moving the pieces.
Yeah. So I want to build on that. First, what happened to vertical integration, and why has it all been by for the last 10 years? I don't think it has been. 10 years ago, I was doing a lot of work with Nokia, and we visited one of their suppliers, Foxconn, and Foxconn had a banner that they put up for the Nokia people when they arrived, and it said, the solution to supply chain management is vertical integration. That is, we'll do everything for you. We, Foxconn, are highly vertically integrated. So did vertical integration go away? I don't think so. What was the last corporate act of Steve Jobs? His last corporate act, last thing he did before he died, and he knew he was going to die, was to go before the city board in Cupertino to get permission to build a single building to house 12,000 Apple workers in one place. That's integration. That's integral. Jobs felt it was critically important that all 12,000 of those people work in the same site because he wants them to interact with each other, because the integrality and the connectivity in that part of the supply chain is critical to him. Now, at the same time, he uses Foxconn for manufacturing. So building on Hal's point, you have some parts that are modular, and you say, okay, we'll put our manufacturing in Foxconn in China, but some parts that are integral, and we have to have all 12,000 of these people under the same roof. So did vertical integration ever go away? No. Has outsourcing ever gone away? No. One has to be selective, and one has to have, in some sense, some subtlety to one's strategy about what do I need to do inside, what do I need to do outside, where do I want to be integral, and where do I want to be modular. And I think the third question about what's global and what's local is a similar kind of a story. For what functions do I need to be geographically close, and for what functions do I not need to be geographically close? And same story with organizationally close, culturally close, electronically close. You can think about closeness of elements in the supply chain on multiple dimensions. And so supply chain design is trying to decide, figuring out which parts of the supply chain have to be close on which dimensions and which ones can be separate. And so Esquel has a certain strategy leveraging the fact that you can build more value by putting some things together and not chasing the lowest labor costs every time costs move a little bit, because you can get more value by keeping things together and being much more integral.
Yeah, building on what the previous panelists, when Charlie and how Marjorie said, let me add a couple of twists to that. Make versus buy. I think that the question traditionally was a question of looking at cost, then it became a little bit of a kind of a strategic question. Today, what I find is that you go to the board level of companies for them to try to understand that. Let me explain a couple of things that happened to me. I remember precisely working with Nokia. They were asking me to teach the purchasing people about business models. And I said, what the hell are you talking about? And they said, our business model is changing dramatically. 70 to 80% of our income goes directly to our suppliers. If they don't know how these decisions are affecting the whole strategy, we are nowhere. So at the same time, I got the Finnish Association of CEOs asking me to teach them about supply chain, because they said we are changing our strategy. And again, 70%, 80% of our revenue goes out to the supply chain. So what I would say is that supply chain has been regarded in many companies as a kind of functional specialization or as a kind of specialization. Companies have been, I would say, flabbergasted by the example of Fung and by the example of fast fashion companies like Inditex, Zara, and Desigual, saying, wow, they have changed the industry. But in general, there's not a lot of understanding about supply chain among the top people. And for the first time, they are saying, our whole strategy, 80% of it is depending on that. So there is a rephrasing, I would say. At top level, there is a kind of trying to learn. The second one, which is about globalization, localization, you were saying, I think that Charlie put it very rightly. Vertical integration has not gone back, but for many companies, they thought that by just having the brand, this is the value added, and we outsource the rest. And there is a huge economy, there's a huge synergy across the value chain that it has been lost. The name of the game in outsourcing has been economies of scale. We go to big factories to try to have economies of scale. We go to China to have huge factories. Some companies, big companies, are saying economies of scale are out. What does that mean? That means that now there is much more about what is the synergies of having different steps in the supply chain integrated. Which goes back a little bit to the competitiveness of China. China has a great internal market. That means if there is a game in which China is excelling in economies of scale, and then just a little bit to be a little bit provocative to Marjorie, I'm Spanish. So we have a very great company in Spain, one of the few that we have, which is called Sara. And they are exactly in the other game. They are in the game of producing short series and reacting very fast. And it's interesting, it's another example, and everybody contrasts Li and Fung versus Sara. And it's interesting that they have built a great company, not based on economies of scale, but based on what is called now fast fashion. And now you have Uniqlo and H&M and everybody copying that. The interesting thing for me is that they have a very local supply chain. The one that is highly value added is local. So are we going to see now the emergence of a lot of value added supply chains following that model? And the interesting thing to me is that I think that we're going to see much more localization than globalization that we have seen in the past.
Great, thank you. Some more questions from the audience. We'll do another round. Yes, right here. Third row.
Yes, my name is Ting Ho from Symphony Holdings out in Hong Kong here. Okay. Now, one of the things that we experience is e-commerce, electronic commerce, the purchasing methods, the people retailing business has changed. And in the US, the same way the channels, some are closing down, consolidating, and fragmenting. So how would this, the new technology and also processes would be able to reduce the kind of uncertainty for a distributor, for the brand manager like ourselves?
So will it reduce it, or it could in fact exacerbate it? Right? So how will the new customer-facing technologies change things? Okay.
Thank you.
Another? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick question. I mean, I work for the United Nations ESCAP, and what we are dealing with is analyzing the impact of natural disasters. And Asia the Pacific region is the region which has been the most affected by these natural disasters, from tsunamis to floodings to earthquakes, you name it. This is, of course, heavily impacting supply chains. How do businesses deal with that? I mean, on the one hand, they're increasing vertical integration. On the other hand, there is still a need for outsourcing. But this, when we talk about risk, this is really a big issue that you cannot predict. How do businesses deal with that when they manage the supply chain?
Great. I might go back to the panel at this point then, because we have two very important, quite different questions. So one of them is kind of e-commerce and the disruption there and how it changes the whole chain. And then now that you have all of this wonderful thing built, what about the increasing frequency of natural disasters and what that implies? So two disruptors of the existing structure. I don't know who wants to begin. Anyone? Yeah.
Well, the first one about e-commerce, it's I will use again the example of the fashion industry. It's very interesting. Until I would say 2-3 years ago, there were only two companies successful in e-commerce in fashion. One was Victoria's Secret, and the other was a European company called La Redoute. Basically, both used to be catalog business, and what they did was to put the catalog on the internet. That was it. All the rest were not successful. I remember Mango, H&M, not successful. 2 or 3 years ago, suddenly the world changed, and now something like 20% of the sales in fashion in many of these companies go through the internet. The impact in supply chain has been tremendous because the consumer behaves in a very strange way. For them, it was a surprise. They realized that the number of returns through the supply chain is something like 50%. Consumers buy, and they return much more than they were used to do in the normal chain. So for many of them, the supply chain has been a total disaster. They need to be adapted. So in that sense, I think that we will see a lot of changes in the supply chain, and if anything, we'll see much more increase of transport, which one of the issues that were mentioned. So that's a little bit what I can add about e-commerce. I would like also to add that for years, we have predicted a lot of things. For years, it never happened. So any prediction is very difficult to trust. The second about how business deal with all these events, they are learning. there is a lot of companies, at least I found a lot of companies, particularly in Europe, that they were affected by things like the ice cloud and all these things, that suddenly they started to look at that. And the interesting thing is there are two things. There are the global multinationals. They are trying precisely now to look at creating supply chains that they can react to these kind of events. They don't know what they are. It's the first time they are putting that on the top of the table. That means, as Victor Fung was talking about, double sourcing, a lot of things, and resilience of supply chain. At the same time, there is a lot of interest in trying to understand how do we react as an opportunity. So some supply chain companies, some transport companies are looking at that as, can we offer to our customers a way to react to this? So it's like, it's a very Chinese reaction of saying every risk is an opportunity. So what you will see is that you will see even consulting companies talking about dynamic supply chains and things like that, about how to deal with risk. So some businesses are really considering that, and others are creating business based on that.
Okay, I guess I'll take on the e-commerce one first. So I have two reactions. One is that's the innovation story. It's going to lead to volatility and destruction, and get used to it. Right? That you seem to be asking, gee, how can I reduce the uncertainty from the innovation of e-commerce? I think the answer is it's not going to happen that way. It's going to be that as you get more innovation, you're going to get more disruption, more change. You're going to get new supply chains and dismantling of some old supply chains. So I think that's one piece of the story. The other piece, just more specifically on e-commerce, this thing about when people order over the internet, they didn't get to try it on, and so therefore they return it more frequently. I think mobile e-commerce may be reversing that somewhat. So literally someone goes in the store, they try it on, but then they order it from Amazon.com or somebody else right off their mobile phone, and so they've already tried it on, and they know they're not going to return it, and so the mobile e-commerce in some sense undoes some of that return problem. On the disasters, I think of the disasters as falling into two camps. One is disruption of commercial supply chains, and the other one is humanitarian supply chains. And I think it was the latter that you were more focused on, or not necessarily? The first. Oh, so more of the disruption. So I think Carlos dealt with that well, and Hao knows the humanitarian better than I anyway, so.
I think one comment about the e-commerce is that the emergence of e-commerce may result in we throwing away our common understanding of what's efficient in the supply chain. I was struck by what Zappos, the founder, has told me one time. As you know, Zappos is a shoe company that you can buy online, and they were so successful that even Amazon could not compete with them successfully, so that eventually Amazon have to buy them. Yeah, that's the way. If you cannot compete with the competitor, well, you just buy them. And Zappos says that in the past, they thought that returns would be bad. So companies said that companies would focus on what can we do to reduce returns. And what Zappos said is that the people who returned the most were their most valuable customers. The customers who returned all the time were the one who would buy a lot from them. And so, in fact, they said they encourage returns. And so they would do everything to make it easy for you to return. So I think one of the insight that I gained is that in the world of e-commerce, it could be quite different from the traditional channels, so that we have to maybe throw away some of our common understanding or the traditional understanding. On the disasters, companies need to develop resilient supply chain, and I think a colleague of Charlie Yossi Sheffy has written a book about it. And the essence of the book really is to, I'm not just doing justice in summarizing the whole book in 1 minute, yeah. But the key is to develop this ability to be flexible. And the flexibility has to be at multiple levels. It starts with design flexibility. What can we do so that the design can be changed quickly to respond? Second is manufacturing flexibility. Third is supply flexibility, so that it's multi-sourcing, backup supplies, logistics flexibility, because sometimes you do not have enough of the containers to go out and in of the country, and that became the constraint. And finally, the ability to influence demand shaping. Because sometimes you can influence demand in such a way so that it avoid the demand coming out of the disaster area or the disaster struck supply sources. So it's building some flexibility at multi-levels perhaps are ways to reduce the impact of a disaster that happened to your supply chain?
Let me start with e-commerce, and I'm surprised to hear what Hao is saying, because we've been monitoring e-commerce, because in China that's a huge, very fast-growing sector. In fact, I just did some work on analyzing Vanco, and one of the problems that Vanco is facing is high number of rejects and returns. But I think there's a cost element, because the per value per order is very low. So that return it's going to kill them. We've had a lot of experience with servicing catalog houses, and it's always been, I've been taught quality. That's the key. Consistent quality. Now, that's what we're very strong in. And in fact, Zara is also one of our customers. So you can even see that even Zara, they have certain products where they want that stability of quality. So that's an area that we're very keen to develop for, because e-commerce demands, in fact, a very high standard of quality from the vendor. Disappointment, you don't go back. So on risk management, we have factories in Vietnam, we have factories in Sri Lanka, etc. Initially, it's because of quota, and now we're keeping those because possible trade conflicts. If there happens with China, Sino-U.S. trade disputes, it's a possibility. We've always been very concerned about when we had SARS. We had to do a lot to split up the work and try to have backup in every possible way, and also chop our production into units, whether it is in the same factory. We've always been thinking about how we can chop up our textile manufacturing, which has the fabric mill. It has a lot of economy of scale, so it's difficult to chop up and have in different locations. So that's something that we're constantly thinking of, and that's why we're always very interested in the history of the flood in the Pearl River Delta, because we're near one of the tributaries, and we're very concerned. So that's something that we look at continuously, but we cannot find a completely satisfactory solution.
Excellent.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, more questions? We're doing very well here in questions and responses. Must be more. Have we exhausted all of the issues? Yes, Mukhtar. Up here we need a microphone in the front row, and then, okay, there, and then we'll go to the second row, and great.
I'm sorry if this has been covered, but recently there was on the cover of The Economist about the third industrial revolution with digital printing and the like. How do you think this is going to change fundamentally traditional supply chain? I know this is lots of prediction and whatever else, but
Industrial revolution, low-scale manufacturing, a whole bunch of things.
No, well, that's at one level,
yeah.
More technology, including some really revolutionary technology.
Okay, good. That's one. Yes, second row.
Yes, Annette Clayton from Schneider Electric. My question was really on managing risk, and one of the risk areas we haven't really talked much about is talent. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts around maybe some innovation you're seeing in some of your work around talent, especially as we see really a shift even in the leadership of many of our local supply chains to local talent.
Let's take one more. Is there one more question? Or shall we? Let's go with those two. So those, again, are quite different. So risk, but now in terms of talent and the balances or imbalances in that, and another source of disruption, which would be new manufacturing technologies. Charlie, do you want to start off in the you're a disruption guy, right? That's your... Here, take a... Yeah.
So I think the the 3D printing possibility is actually quite exciting, and I actually thought I'm going to go out and buy one of those things for my kids and teach them how to make anything. We have a course at MIT called How to Make Almost Anything, and it's taught by a professor in the Media Lab, Neil Gershenfeld, and he has what he calls the Fab Lab, and the Fab Lab is a relatively small set of machines, and he takes students into his course and says we can make anything in the Fab Lab. And not only has he built a Fab Lab at MIT, but there are about several dozen Fab Labs around the world, including some in India, some in China, and he's basically trying to enable people in any part of the world to make anything that they need. Anything. You need a spare part, you need a shirt, you need whatever you need, you can make it in the Fab Lab, and the Fab Lab is a relatively cheap invention, all right? Goodbye global supply chains, right? The only thing you have to ship overseas is the electronic code, the instruction to the machine of what to make, and then you're there, right? So saves a lot on transportation costs. Once you ship the Fab Lab, you don't have to ship materials anymore. So I think the possibility of significant disruption from make anything anywhere is very exciting. It will create value, but it will destroy supply chains, and we shall see how it'll evolve. But I wouldn't bet against it.
From Margie's smile, I see some possible response here.
Okay. This is the MIT guys. So, you forgot to say that it's also in Hong Kong. I'm council chair of Hong Kong PolyU, and we think we've got more 3D printers than the Media Lab and all of MIT. In fact, Victor spent quite a bit. Victor Fung took many people from Fung over last week, just promoting PolyU a little bit here. Now, I thought about that, so I got Peter Schwartz from MIT to give me a quote on a 3D printed shirt that you can wear. That you can wear. You can even wear. If you give me an order, I will have it made for you. 20,000 US.
There'll be a market, I'm sure. People want $20,000 shirts.
Yeah, I think there is. I think there is a market for but I think the opportunities are in really the product development side, and a lot of opportunity, and we're really looking into digitizing the entire product development cycle as much as possible. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in using digital technology. I'm not sure it's going to stop sewing yet, but tremendous opportunity.
Can I rebut?
Yes.
How much did you pay for your mobile phone 25 years ago when you bought your first one, and how much did you pay now? Per CPU cycle.
Now that's why I'm very, very keen to pursue this. I've got Peter actually making that. So I'm really interested to see how we can move with that. Because there are also other, there's also the issue of how does it feel? Because we tried, this comes to a question, because we're in the men's market, men are a lot more demanding. For women, hear me out. Women, if we look good in something, we will put up with the discomfort. Men are a lot more difficult because they want to look good, but they also want to feel good, right? If you can't sweat in your shirt comfortably, you don't want to wear it. So there are a lot of, we're very interested, but I think we've got quite a bit of challenge. So, but having said that, there's also synthetic biology. There's a lot of development in biology that could also be offer disruptive opportunities there. So we in fact agree.
We agree.
We agree.
So any more on the disruptive manufacturing technologies?
Yeah. I'll just add one more example of how these type of new disruptive technologies can make a difference. And it actually is related to my earlier point about some companies that were purely manufacturing company or product-based company, and they transformed themselves to be a much more service-based company. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, that purely was definitely a manufacturing company because they are a fab, right? They make wafer fabrication for their customers. But what they discover is that if they are able to create a computer simulation that would simulate the manufacturing of a product, then some of the customers do not have to make a prototype of the maskings in their fabrication. So in the design phase, masks are very expensive. Each prototype can cost $50,000 all the way to $1 million for just a mask of a prototype. But if you can digitize it, then it costs almost nothing. That you can do multiple iterations to improve the design before you physically manufacture the product. And that was a tremendous value add to their customers. So that's a particular service here. On the talent thing, I actually agree with you that the SEM World did a survey last year, and they discovered that this is one of the most critical problem faced by supply chain executives, the chief supply chain officers. And the reason why supply chain talents are so difficult to retain or to get is mainly because the so-called supply chain people are no longer easy, simple supply chains that we're dealing with. So my very good friend Corey Billington, that used to be a professor at IMD, he was a vice president of procurement for Hewlett-Packard. And he says that used to be at Hewlett-Packard, if you want to be an executive in procurement, it's very simple. You just look for the lowest cost seller, and then you buy from them, and they give them the best quote as long as they meet the quality standard, delivery schedule, and that's good. But now procurement is a portfolio manager. You almost have to learn financial options to understand completely how to manage a portfolio. And so I think that's the complexity of the need that drive it, and the mobility of those people. And so I think some companies have taken the approach of doing much more in-house training. So of course, as a professor, I always would encourage them to do so by creating training programs and then hire professors to come in and do those training. Right. That, by the way, is what Li and Fung is doing. And both Charlie and I are helping Li and Fung to do the internal training. So we do need to invest in the talent pool because the job is so much more complicated these days.
Carlos.
Let me build on that. One of the things that, and I'm going to add a very different twist on the new technologies in manufacturing. I live in a country called Switzerland. And it was interesting, we had a conference a couple of months ago about manufacturing in Switzerland. I mean, you can think about who on earth is going to manufacture in such an expensive country. Well, you might be surprised to know that after Germany, Switzerland is the country with the highest manufacturing base in Europe. And you can think about watches and so on. Now, the interesting thing is that this is what they call emotional manufacturing. Victor, I know somebody else was referring to, it's good sometimes to have something made in Italy. It has a value for the consumer. The issue is, if we look at manufacturing, we are going far away from mass manufacturing to much more niche. I always use an example as Audi. I remember 10 years ago, Audi had basically three models, the A4, A6, and A8. Now they have the A0, A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6, A7, Q3, Q5. So if anything, we are increasing the complexity and the number of products that we make of the same are much smaller. That's what we see. And I think some of these new technologies are going to allow the development of that, of this exclusivity in that sense. And this is why I use the watch industry. The watch industry is one of the big users, and it's very traditional, but at the same time, they're looking at all this technology to develop that. So we may see basically there a development because the consumer is driving much more towards unique products. And the second part about the talent risk is, to me, was a surprise a little bit for how I'm the director of a forum at IMD called the Value Chain 2020. We have 10 companies, everybody is specialized looking in supply chain. And one of the areas they wanted us to do research was precisely about leadership in supply chains. Is building on what Howe said about being complex, there is another aspect which becomes much more difficult, which is typically these people is supposed to work across the organization. So if you think about finance people, they work in finance. You think about marketing, they work in marketing. You think about supply chain, they need to coordinate finance people and marketing people and outside people. So from a leading point of view, from a leadership point of view, it's something amazing. Think about that. I'm an engineer. More supply chain people come as an engineering background. engineers who are extremely bad, and I talk about myself, are leading different people if they are not engineers. We believe that anybody who's not an engineer, they don't have a right to live. And then basically what happens is that suddenly you need to coordinate people who is thinking in different ways. And that creates a huge challenge. From a leadership point of view, is huge. That means, and that's one of the weakest points today of many people in supply chain, you need to lead across functions. So that means you need to have people who has a business view. And that's very difficult. And on top of that, many people like that is not attracted to supply chain.
It's interesting how on the talent answer you both picked up, or all of you picked up on the talent required to manage the supply chain. But I think you were also pointing to the supply chain as a talent chain, right? And how do you, we're moving product, but frankly, we're moving talent at the end of the day. And where is the talent, and how does that get upstream, either through product or service? So maybe